All right, continuing these best case, worst case videos, running through a list of teams, giving you the absolute best case scenario in terms of regular season record and the absolute worst case if everything goes wrong. And up today, the Corn Dogs. I didn't have much to say about the Corn Dogs last year, did I?
So congratulations, Corn Dogs, for putting me and the rest of the Georgia fans out of our friggin' misery.
No, not really. Anyway, let's go. Hey, good morning, it's Uncle Lou here. Yeah, that's right, it's me, Uncle Lou, and I'm live for you on LouTube today. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it also. And two, big shout out to Ryan and Tiger Cat over on the Uncle Lou Patreon page. They both requested an LSU best case, worst case video. And per usual, if you ask, Uncle Lou will deliver for you too. Yeah. Thank you guys. I really appreciate you guys supporting the channel over on the Patreon page. If you're not on the Uncle Lou Patreon page, you want to get yourself signed up, there's a link in the description of this video that says support the channel. It'll take you over there. It's real easy to get signed up, and you can let me know what team you want to see me do in these best case, worst case videos that we're doing for the next 3 or 4 weeks or whatever. Anyway, up today, like I mentioned, the LSU Corn Dogs. Okay, how'd they do last year? Pretty good. A lot better than preseason expectations, right? A lot of people had LSU hovering around the 7 or 8 win mark for last year in terms of preseason predictions, and obviously they exceeded that. 9-3 in the regular season, 5-3 in the SEC. Finished the season 10-3 with a big win in a New Year's Six Bowl over Central Florida. Was that the Fiesta Bowl? I believe it was the Fiesta Bowl. Losses during the season: on the road at Florida, at home against Alabama, in really what was a disappointing game for LSU. Now, I thought the defense played really, really good in that game. You hold an offense like Alabama to 29 points, you're giving yourself a chance to win. Unfortunately, LSU's offense just wasn't able to do anything in that game. Of course, they got shut out there. And then they lost their last game of the regular season in overtime to Texas A&M, and I watched that game. It was an entertaining game. There are some things you can point to in that game if you're an LSU fan and sort of scratch your head in terms of officiating. I don't buy into the conspiracy theories surrounding it that the SEC or whatever just hates LSU. I just think the referees blew some calls there towards the end of that game. I don't think it's some mass conspiracy to try to hold LSU down, but obviously there were some rough calls that went against LSU in that game, and you ended up losing. Now, in the grand scheme of things, that loss didn't really matter. You weren't winning the SEC West whether you won or lost that game, and you still got a New Year's Six Bowl, and you still won it. So a really good year for LSU, 10-3. Like I said, most people had them going 7-5, maybe 8-4, something like that, heading into last season. So far exceeded those expectations, and one of the big reasons why, quarterback Joe Burrow. They bring this guy in as a transfer from Ohio State. He gets to start, and he had a good, not great year, although he looked great at certain times, right? Obviously, the Alabama game stands out as a game where he struggled. Georgia game, I thought he played great. The Fiesta Bowl, probably the best game he played all year. He threw the ball around. Definitely one of his best passing games of the year there in the Fiesta Bowl. He comes back this year, which is a huge deal for LSU. LSU returns their quarterback, all of their wide receivers, 4 of 5 starting offensive linemen, and their offensive coordinator. This is very unusual for LSU over the last 5 or 6 years. If you look at LSU and you say, what's the problem been over the last few years? Offense, right? Well, why? Consistency and below average, subpar quarterback play, right? Coaching turnovers. Not the case this year. You bring back Joe Burrow, who had probably the best season at quarterback of any LSU quarterback in at least 4, 5, 6 years, and you keep your offensive coordinator, which is something you've had a hard time doing, either because you fired him or you lost him or whatever. Continuity on the offensive line, returning 4 or 5. All those playmakers at wide receiver, literally every one of your top wide receivers returns. You got to figure something out at the running back position, but LSU always recruits well. This year was no exception, finishing with a top 10 class again. Now, on defense, some good and some bad, right? You lose your best 2 players, or what most people would consider to be your best 2 players, linebacker Devin White, cornerback Greedy Williams. Now, LSU has not been hurting on the defensive side of the ball for a long time. It's an NFL factory, LSU's defense. That isn't going to change. LSU is going to have a ton of talent on the defensive side of the ball, but no matter how well you recruit, it's never easy to replace your best player, much less your best two players. Now, you'll have plenty of talent over there. Like I said, another top 10 class. Again, you do got to replace Greedy Williams, but if there's one level of LSU's defense where the talent is just ridiculously good, it's the secondary. You signed the number 1 cornerback in 2019. I don't think anybody will be surprised if he ends up getting to start. And you return your number 2 corner opposite of Greedy Williams from last year. So if that freshman is as good as what a lot of people think he will be, you'll be okay at the corner position again for next year. Safety, young talent, lots of young talent. And I mean, you lose Devin White, like we mentioned, but you return, what's the other guy, the other middle linebacker, Phillips, I think his name is. He was your second leading tackler, and you get him back. So I don't think anyone expects LSU's defense to fall off a cliff, but we do need to see LSU play a couple of games and see how they go about replacing the production and the talent of a Devin White and a Greedy Williams. So those are some question marks on the defensive side of the ball. You keep your defensive coordinator too. So anyway, you guys know how we do this here. We go through the schedule quick. This is not a game-by-game prediction video. I do those over the summer starting in June. What we're going to do today is we're going to run through the schedule briefly, and I'm going to give you what I think the best case scenario is in terms of overall regular season record for LSU and a worst case scenario. Maybe you have some injuries. Maybe you get upset a couple of times. You know, like if everything goes wrong, what's the worst LSU could do? So, all right, here we go. Here's the schedule, and we'll run through it real quick. All right, you open up at home against Georgia Southern. Week 2, one of the biggest non-con games of the year in all of college football, at Texas. You start talking to people right now about the big non-con games they're excited for in 2019. Everybody names the same 4 or 5 games, and on that list is LSU at Texas week 2. You also got Miami, Florida week 1. You got Georgia, Notre Dame week 4. Those games are on everyone's list, and this is going to be one of the biggest non-con games of the year. Week 3 at home against Northwestern. So you start off with 3 non-con games there before your first SEC game on the road at Vandy. Vandy is your rotating opponent from the East that you draw this year. Pretty good draw there. If you have to go on the road and play a team in the SEC, Vandy is the way to go. No home field advantage there. One of the smallest stadiums in the SEC. And Vandy, the second worst team in the East, behind, of course, everyone's lovable loser, the Tennessee Vols. That takes you into your first bye week. Of course, I mention this in every video. I'm going to mention it again. 2 bye weeks in college football this season. Not a change. This isn't something permanent. It just happened to be the way the calendar falls this year. They require 2 bye weeks. So you get your first bye week after your first SEC game and your 4th overall game. Good place to have it in my mind. Then you come back home for your final non-conference game of the year against Utah State, followed up by a home game against your East Division rival, Florida. This was a great game last year, one that Florida won at home. LSU looking for revenge this year in Death Valley. You got to go on the road at Mississippi State, home to Auburn, right? Then your second bye week, and then Bama. Is that 12 games? No, there's more. At Bama, followed up with a trip at Ole Miss, home to Arkansas, home to Texas A&M. This Texas A&M game, I'm high on Texas A&M this year. I'm high on LSU too. I'm high on Texas A&M this year. Now, obviously, everyone and their brother, I think, is going to pick Alabama to win the West, okay? I think you're going to have a few people go with LSU, and I think you're going to have a few people go with Texas A&M. The point is, if Alabama does stumble and fall a time or two this season, this game, a home game for LSU, your last game of the regular season, at home against Texas A&M, this game could potentially be for the SEC West. I think the 3 best teams in the West are Alabama, LSU, and Texas A&M. So, like I said, if Alabama stumbles a time or two, this LSU-Texas A&M game could become one of the biggest games of the year in a hurry. So that's the schedule. We're going to break it down into a couple of different parts like we always do, and then we'll try to come up with a best-case, worst-case scenario in terms of overall regular season record. Let's take a look at the non-con. Georgia Southern, at Texas, Northwestern, Utah State. So only one away non-con game, but it's your toughest one on the schedule at Texas. Obviously, that's a potential loss there. Again, not predicting that LSU will win or lose that game, but you have to at least consider the possibility. Texas is going to be a top 10 team preseason, as is LSU. It's in Texas. I'm not going to lie to you. I have a feeling Texas will be favored in this game by a couple of points. So you have to at least consider the possibility that that could be a loss. The other three you're most likely to win, at least on paper. Okay? Now, what about your away games? Of course, we mentioned at Texas. That's going to be tough. At Vandy, there's not an easier draw you could get out of the SEC East. And then your SEC West road games this year at Mississippi State. Most people expect them to take a step back. On the road at Alabama, you're not going to be expected to win that game. Let's just be real. Alabama's going to be favored. And on the road at Ole Miss, a team that I think is going to be pretty terrible. Not the worst away schedule you could possibly have. Anytime you got to play at Alabama, obviously that's very, very difficult to do. Your other SEC games, though, in my mind, are against three of the worst teams in the SEC. Definitely three of the worst five, I think. Ole Miss, Mississippi State, and Vandy. You should be able to win all three of those games. Texas and Bama are going to be the iffy ones, in my mind. What about the toughest three-game stretch here? Well, what about Florida at home, on the road at Mississippi State, and then home against Auburn? Now, obviously, none of those three games are your toughest games. Your toughest games, Texas, Bama, and Texas A&M, but those are surrounded by some not-so-tough games, right? Georgia Southern and Northwestern sandwich the Texas game. Bama, you have a bye week the week before you play them. Then you play on the road at Ole Miss, a terrible team. And then Texas A&M, you play Arkansas the week before you play them, the worst team in the SEC last year. So I think your toughest three-game stretch is probably Florida, then on the road at Mississippi State, and then home against Auburn. Florida and Auburn always seemed... The Florida LSU game and the Auburn LSU game always seemed to be pretty good games. And they sandwiched on the road at Mississippi State, which leads me to the trap games. At Mississippi State could potentially be a trap game here. Obviously, Mississippi State is the worst of those three games in that three-game stretch. It would be really easy to sort of overlook them. Plus, you got to play them on the road in Starkville. Plenty of cowbell there, unfortunately, which is the dumbest thing in all of college football, which is really saying something. So I think you have to consider the at Mississippi State game as a potential trap game. The Arkansas game could turn into a trap game, maybe. We'll have to see. Like I mentioned, if Bama were to stumble a couple of times, maybe you beat them. That Texas A&M game at the end of the year could be for the SEC West, in which case you don't want to get caught looking past a terrible Arkansas team, focus too much on that A&M game. So some potential there. What about Georgia Southern as a potential trap game? Now, we saw LSU lose at home a couple of years ago to Troy. Georgia Southern, a much better team than Troy. I don't expect Georgia Southern to win this game, but with that huge matchup against Texas looming in week 2, maybe it's possible. Now, with Georgia Southern being the first game of the year, you would think LSU would come out pumped and ready to go. So I don't expect Georgia Southern to sneak up on LSU and get a win, but I felt like it at least had to be included as a potential trap game, given where it falls on the schedule before Texas. At Mississippi State, no. At Ole Miss, maybe. No. So, what's the absolute best case scenario for LSU here? I think LSU is going to have a good team. I think they're going to have one of the best offenses they've had in a while. They're definitely going to have the best offense, I think, that they've had under Ed Orgeron. They've got some questions on defense, but LSU always seems to field a pretty good defense no matter how many players they lose to the NFL. The away schedule is pretty favorable, I think, with the exception of the trip to Alabama, not including the Texas game because that's a non-con game. It's very hard to go undefeated. I think 11-1 is the absolute best case scenario. I can't see 12-0 with this schedule. I just think Texas A&M, the potential of a loss is too high. Bama, the potential of a loss is too high. I think Florida's going to have a good team. I mean, those are 3 top 10 teams you got to play. Florida, Bama, and Texas A&M. I think, are all top 10 teams. Texas is a top 10 team. Almost half your schedule is top 10 teams. I cannot see you going undefeated here. I think if the offense takes 5 or 6 steps forward and the defense finds a way to play as well as they played last year and finds replacements for your Devin White, your Greedy Williams, I think 11-1 is possible. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you go 11-1 with this schedule, you're one of the best 2 or 3 teams in America, period. This is a tough schedule. At Texas, at Bama, Texas A&M, Florida. That's a tough 4 games right there. Now, they're spread out, but that's a tough 4 games. I don't know if there's anybody in America who could beat all 4 of those teams in the same season. So I think 11-1 is the absolute best case, okay? Again, that's a compliment, okay? I know everybody wants to go 12-0. It's the offseason. 11-1 with this schedule would be amazing, and you would 100% be ranked in the top 3 or 4 if you finish this regular season at 11-1, without question, okay? Worst case scenario, you got to consider the possibility that you lose to Texas, Bama, and Texas A&M. So that's at least 3 potential losses. I would add Florida. That's 4 potential losses. Now, I do not expect you to lose all 4 of those games. This is a worst case scenario we're looking at here. I think 8-4, worst case scenario. I do not expect LSU to go 8-4. And again, this summer when I do the detailed, in-depth preview and predictions, I will go through game by game and give you a winner and a loser for every single game. I don't think you do any worse than 8-4, though. This is a tough schedule. There is a lot of teams in America that would be looking at 4-8 with this schedule. I'm telling you right now. LSU's a talented team, though. 8-4, absolute worst case scenario. Best case scenario, 11-1, and you finish the regular season ranked in the top 2 or 3. If that were to happen, you'd win the West, and you'd be ranked the top 2 or 3. Then you get housed by Georgia in the SEC title game. Have a great day!